Welcome very much to the Development Control Committee B for this evening. There are no planned fire alarms, so if the fire alarm does sound, it's back out through the main doors that you came in through and then down the ramps. Do we have any apologies?
Yes, Chair, a couple of apologies. Councillor Katja Haunchen and Councillor Chris Windows.
Fantastic. Do we have any declarations of interest for today? Nope. Oh, Chris.
I'd just like to say I'm a ward councillor for one of the applications.
Great. But that keeps you completely still independently minded, doesn't it?
Of course.
Of course. Brilliant. Okay. Do we have any issues with the minutes of the previous meeting held on the 8th of March, or are we happy to agree those? Good, great, fabulous. Okay, action sheet. Do we have any actions?
There's no action from the last meeting.
Brilliant.
Chair.
And over to appeals.
Okay, thank you, Chair. If members could bear with me, as I've advised earlier today, there's three decisions I just wanted to take you through, but I will summarise it because I've sent around all of the decisions to members to read afterwards as well. There's a particular order I wanted to take them in. And the first one I wanted to cover was one that was mentioned to you last time around, which was Marksbury Road, which of course was an application that you considered a little while ago. That's number 44 on the appeal sheet, just for information. And in sort of broad summary there, the committee had refused that on 3 grounds against the officer recommendation, and it therefore went to appeal. And unfortunately, the planning inspector found against the council on all 3 grounds in terms of ecology, drainage and fire access, I believe. The inspector felt that the council was unable to substantiate any of those reasons for refusal, and so allowed the appeal. Costs had been applied for by the applicants, and again, unfortunately, have been awarded against the council because of that inability to substantiate the reasons for refusal. Now, in the cost decision here, and with the others we'll just talk about here, the inspectors are really clear that it is absolutely within the right of members to take a different view to officers. So that's, you know, always, inspectors are always really clear to set that out, but unfortunately, where they feel that the reasons used to refuse an application can't be substantiated, they're more likely to say it's unreasonable behaviour and award costs against us. So that is what happened in that case. Just kind of something to think about going forward is that, and you will have heard me say this before on some other cases in the past, if you're going against officer recommendation, my strong advice would be to pick one good reason that you can hang an argument on. The more reasons that are there, the more that could be shot down by an inspector, and it kind of builds up the exposure to costs, unfortunately. There's 2 more I just wanted to go through, and then obviously I'm available for questions. So the second one I wanted to talk about, which is item 37 on the appeal papers, is Land at Home Gardens, and members I'm sure will recall that one. I think we did a site visit ahead of the second hearing of the application. Now the good news on that one, because that again was refused against officer recommendation, the appeal was actually dismissed, so the inspector agreed that planning permission should be refused. Now it had been refused on 3 grounds. The ground that the inspector agreed with the committee on was that in terms of the overbearing impact of the proposed development on the 2-storey residential properties nearby. I remember walking around those properties and looking at that, and it was very much a matter of judgment, and the inspector agreed with the member view on that it was unacceptable. So that's why the appeal was dismissed. And then in the inspector's appeal decision, they didn't support the council's case on the impact of construction traffic coming through the neighbouring development and also day-to-day traffic once the development was occupied. So the inspector didn't agree with that, but you only need one reason to get appeal dismissed. In that case, though, the appellants had also applied for costs. On the ground that the council was successful on, the inspector said no, that's a matter of judgment. Members are fully entitled to disagree with their officers, and here there was clear reasons why permission should be refused, so no costs awarded on that ground. The inspector was kind of more kind of 50-50 on the kind of the finished development traffic impact on the neighbouring development. But where the inspector was critical of the council was the reason for refusal about construction traffic impact. And the reason for that was that it is always possible to put a construction management plan on a development to try and mitigate the development. I think the inspector recognised it was the only time the council, I think, has ever refused permission on that ground. And so we've got what's called a partial awards of costs, so we'll have to pay the costs of the appellants for submitting evidence on that ground only. So it's a limited exposure, but nonetheless it's still a costs award against us. And again, I think the lesson from that one is if it's even though there may well be understandable concern about the impact of construction traffic, it can always be mitigated to a degree by construction management plan conditions. So that was the key learning point from that one. And then the final one I wanted to talk about on the same lines, ended with some good news. This is the Merchants Arms, Bell Hill, Stapleton. And that didn't come to committee, but the reason I'm bringing it is that a little while ago, we'll all remember the Windmill Public House application and the issues that we got involved with there. And there was some learning from that appeal decision. This appeal decision has also helped as well. So there was an appeal against non-determination. So this is where the applicant feels that they kind of ran out of patience with the council of making the decision, and they want to go to the planning inspectorate. So that's what happened here. And by doing that, they expect to have the appeal allowed, in their favour. But in this case, and the appeal decision is well worth reading in terms of other public house conversion applications, and that the inspector felt that the marketing of the vacant public house had not been extensive enough and hadn't really been done in a way that would attract new entrants into the market in the way that has happened around the city as well. So the inspector was critical about that as well. And whilst the inspector then, because you only have to satisfy one of those criteria, the inspector went on to consider the new practice note that the council has put together in terms of how to assess public house conversions, and sort of gave that a lot of weight. So I think rewinding back to the windmill situation, we didn't have a detailed practice note about how to assess like distances and alternative provision. We've now got that, so that's really helpful. And here an inspector has given that weight, so that's really, really positive. And then also back then we didn't have access to professional advice about how to market or how to consider whether a pub is still viable or not. And we do now have access to that information. So going forward, applications of that nature, we've got more tools in the toolkit, so to speak. And so the council won the appeal. Costs were applied for there, and the inspector considered, well, look, I've agreed with the council here, so therefore I've got no reason to find that there's any unreasonable behaviour at all, so costs are not awarded. So just to end on those three with the really good news, and that sort of empowers the council going forward in pub conversions. And then the final one I'll just briefly bring to your attention is item 5, which you'll know all about, which is the Brislington Meadows appeal. The inquiry finished, I think it was about a month ago. There have been some exchange of correspondence since on costs. The inspector will take a view on that ultimately, and also the council is making a final submission, well, all parties are making a final submission about biodiversity net gain tomorrow, that we're going to be given the deadline on. And so as to when the timescale for a decision is, you never know, but it might be by the end of this month, or I wouldn't expect it to go beyond the end of next month, and we all eagerly await that decision. So that's the appeal update this time around. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. It's some great news. Any questions from the committee? Go on, Guy, I know you do. And one from Chris.
Thanks, Chair. Sorry, Gary. just to very quickly acknowledge the Maple Road decision as well, which is obviously a huge relief. The thing I was going to ask was, in respect to the point that you were making around transport and attaching transport management plan, is that what you... Construction management plan, that's the one, to deal with the flow of vehicles to and from the site. Because very often there's very little detail in the planning applications around that and how that's going to be managed. Often we're in a situation where if we were to delay coming to a decision until we had more detail on that, would we not end up in a situation where we're risking an appeal against non-determination anyway? So in other words, if an applicant wants to put in an application where they think that might be a problem, it seems that they would be best off leaving out all of the detail, leaving the committee in the position where they're not reassured that our policy is being followed. How do we get out of that? What's the response?
Yeah. So the inspector's position on construction management plans was that you can always mitigate that by having a detailed construction management plan. And in the Home Gardens decision, the inspector went to extravagant detail about what could be put in place in terms of that. They sort of half wrote the construction management plan themselves. So the thing to guard to kind of guard against is if something can be conditioned, you can't really refuse on that ground. So in a situation where there's not much information in a construction management plan, I mean, to be honest, if it's in a really difficult position to construct, then I think we would always encourage the applicant to provide as much information as possible, because in this kind of scenario, we're always saying to applicants, your decision could hinge on this. You've got to reassure people, both the local community and also the members. And so we always encourage that. But if they're not very forthcoming in something like that, ultimately they'll have to get to that level of detail. And it wouldn't be unusual, say, for if you're in the same situation again and you want to know more detail about the construction management plan, I would say don't refuse permission because it isn't there in any kind of detail, but put the condition on. What you can always ask is for the condition to either come back to the agenda meeting or even the committee if you want to see that level of detail and provide public reassurance that, the construction methods have been really well thought out and will be as good as they can be.
Thank you very much. Chris and then Lorraine. All right, we'll go for Lorraine. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks, Chris. Thanks, Chair. I just have a question about the pub decision. It's really long because I read it and it went on and on and on. So in a good sense, it's good that I can see the inspectorate really considered it. But I think my question was, I don't know if it's appropriate for here, so do forgive me if I'm asking you a really stupid question in the wrong place. But because somebody owns the pub, where they recommend it, as in own the building now, are they saying that the appellant should either just sell the building to somebody else, or they could re-appeal against the decision if they do more work around the viability of it being a pub? Do you see what I mean? I just stopped reading it because it was really long. So
it's always the case that the council and the appellants will read different things into a decision. So I think it's a good decision, but it also gives the appellant a kind of signpost as to what to do next. But in that case, the signposting is, well, market it properly, have more open marketing, and don't run an exercise that will just put off everyone apart from the big pub operators, because one of the biggest pub operators were the party that sold it in the first place. They're not going to buy it back, are they? So I think it's a positive signposting for them, and it could be that at the end of that process that there isn't anybody, even though there's a strong community group involved with this, that would like to take it on, but obviously it's got to be purchased at a reasonable rate. But the inspector was very critical of them not running a proper marketing process. So it's much more than a tick box exercise that the inspector's after. So the appellant, they've got to operate, to take the next step, they've got to run that marketing exercise if they want to do something different with the pub. And it could well be, let's hope that exercise will actually generate some interest and it can stay as a public house. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I've got a follow-up question, actually. In terms of that, is there any learning that we're doing as a council for that we can apply to other commercial properties? Because that the viability argument and the poor marketing is something that's used to prevent or convert a lot of commercial premises into accommodation, normally substandard quite often. So like what learning are we doing to sort of strengthen our arm in other related areas?
Yeah, I think other like employment uses have always been subject to a requirement for marketing. And I think over the years I've seen the council take varying approaches to that. I think it's something that should still happen, but sort of overshadowing all of this is our position on housing land supply. It's not where it needs to be. It's not no one's fault. It's a very unfair bar that government set, but nonetheless we are assessed by that. So if it's about redeveloping, say, an employment site for housing, that's kind of leaning towards approving that in principle. And also if it's within one of the regeneration areas identified in the draft local plan, even though that's only draft, in the current circumstances will be expected to lean towards approval in principle. But nonetheless, the marketing still needs to take place. So it still applies. I just get the sense that pubs are treated as understandably as a special case, because once you lose one, it's gone forever, and you're less likely to find something like that reappear all of a sudden. So
I'm thinking particularly about retail shops being and losing retail units on high streets, which are also under threat, particularly at the moment, and then losing that community infrastructure.
Yeah, and the real disadvantage over that is that government recently changed permitted development rights and created the E-use class, whether it's easier to convert from those uses to residential. So, and inbuilt into that is a erosion of those kind of facilities. So that's not good. But unfortunately, that's in place at the moment.
Yeah, because again, we'll never get it back once it's gone, or very unlikely. Okay, thank you. Now, Chris, you had a question.
Yeah, 2 points, Gary. Obviously, I'm very disappointed with the Martesbury Road decision, and it says about cost, but I couldn't find anywhere how much that's going to cost us. Are we allowed to publish that?
We're allowed to publish it. The trouble is, at that stage, we don't know, because at that stage, the inspector is just saying to both parties, right, costs are applicable here. So what normally happens is that the appellant will send us a figure. We will go through that in detail. I don't want to comment any further on that, but it's scrutinised to a large extent because it's public money. We're only going to hand over the costs that apply in that case, really. So we look for evidence about that they have genuinely spent that money in defending those grounds of appeal. So we won't know for a little while, really, what the actual figures are, because what the inspectors don't do, they don't say what the amount is. They just say whether they are applicable or not. But if we don't agree in good time, it can go to the court in terms of resolving the claim, and we always want to avoid that.
Thank you. And secondly, I've read through the reasons why. Obviously, they didn't take into account the covenant that's on the land that can't be built on, what's the council said. So this may well cost us more money, because now would that be the planning team do that, or would that be the legal team that will now say you still can't build on it because of the covenant when you bought the land? So what happens with that, if you could... I think this is the right place to ask.
Yeah, so the resolution of that would be through legal and planning colleagues, but the inspector does give them does give the covenant a brief mention. Paragraph 18 of the appeal decision, it just says it simply, restricted covenants are not for me to consider under the provisions of a planning appeal. And so that's they don't, even though it's an integral part of bringing a site forward, as we say, really quite often in planning, you're not dealing with the wide remit, you're dealing only with the planning issues, even though common sense says you should look at it all. Unfortunately, we can't. And the inspector obviously reinforces that.
No, but that's going to cost us, the decision the inspector made is now going to cost the council a lot more money in defending the covenant it put on it. Am I right in thinking that?
I don't know enough about that process, to be honest, so I honestly don't know.
Leaving present. And I'm very sorry to see you go. You're an excellent officer. Could you find out?
I will find out. And that, yeah.
That's your leaving present from me.
Thank you so much.
Cheers, Gary.
Fab, thank you much. Any more questions? We're good? Okay, let's move to enforcement, please.
Thank you, Chair. And yeah, delighted as ever to see in the papers that there is an enforcement notice served since the last meeting of the committee, and especially as again, look at any particular, it relates to a HMO. So yeah, we've served quite a few notices on HMOs over the last few months through the support and encouragement of members, and I think there's still some more to come.
That is music to our ears, I am sure. Okay, right, we're going to move on to the first item on the agenda of application. Can't speak anymore. Okay, so it's Melvin Square, and we have, I believe we've got 2 speakers for the public forum. So I'd like to first call John Rooney. You have 1 minute. Make sure you speak into the mic. Thank you.
2 reasons have been put forward for refusal: design and amenity. Following objections from 85 Daventry Road, we've pulled the building further back from the boundary and away from the rear garden. No objections were raised to this revised scheme. On design, the case officer accepts that the design rationale is understood and not objectionable in isolation, but essentially wants us to copy the existing rank of shops on the square. We want to do something better to lift the area. We think Carpenter's Place is a strong design which is desirable to emulate. There's lots to like about this scheme, and hence so much local support. There's the social benefits of more housing for the area. There's the environmental benefits of reusing the airspace above the shop and improving the offering in the shop, thereby reducing the need to travel, and the economic benefits of supporting the proposed new local centre. And for those reasons, we'd ask for your support tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I forgot to explain the traffic light system, but it starts off on green when you've got a whole minute, and it goes down to amber at 30 seconds, and then it goes to red when you've run out of time. Next, I'd like to call Councillor Zoe Goodman, but you're going to do yours from over there, aren't you?
Yep.
Only stand if you feel like you can.
Okay.
Sit
Easier
down.
to sit, if that's
Thank
all right.
you.
Yeah. Okay. In response to the officer's report and conclusions, I'd like to make the following points. The uniformity of the rhythm and balance of the existing street scene is already disrupted by the development at Carpenter's Place, which is on the opposite side of Melvin Square. This itself is not detrimental to the square. The proposed development is thus not highly incongruous in that context. I also feel there's too much uniformity in Philwood, which stifles provision of a diversity of accommodation types, particularly 1 and 2 bedroom properties, which this development will provide, and as is noted by the officer, will add to the mix of available accommodation in the area. The scale, massing and proximity to the boundary with neighbouring properties has been reduced from the original application and earlier applications, I believe to an acceptable extent. Shadowing diagrams have now also been submitted, indicating minimal changes from the current construction. The ground floor store is a popular local convenience store that currently has very limited floor space. It has narrow aisles that lead to overcrowding at times, which restrict access to people in wheelchairs or those with buggies. The improved layout would provide 50% more floor space, and this proposed expansion of floor space would allow expansion of the fresh produce range, which is an important consideration given that Philwood currently has no supermarkets.
Can you wind up now, please, Zoe?
I consider these benefits outweigh the perceived harm to the character of the surrounding area and detriment to residential amenity, and therefore would like to recommend its approval by the committee with suitable conditioning by officers as noted in the report. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll move over to the officer presentation. All the committee have been sent these as slides earlier, so we'll be looking at our laptops, not necessarily the screen. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'll try and keep it brief, really. So, yeah, as you will see in the report, the site comprises of a convenience store with a non-self-contained accommodation over. We're also looking at number 1 Illminster Avenue, which is a semi-detached property its last established lawful use is as a semi-detached house. But as you can see on there, there's various extensions which come to plans are currently used for storage. This is just a view of the property, just looking at the front of it. So you've got number 10 Melvin Square, and you've got 1 Illminster Avenue adjoining it. And there's a garage building in the middle, which is currently used for loading. These are just further views of the context of the area, as you've heard. So you've got the, in the background there, number 10 Melvin Square, Illminster Avenue. On the picture on the right, you just have the view of the shops nearby on the other side of the square. This is just a view of the that extension to the rear of 1 Illminster Avenue, taken from number 3, just showing you showing the view of the back of the properties in question. This view is taken from the shop facing the other side of Melvin Square. So you've got Carpenter's Place opposite, which has been mentioned in the statement you heard, and then you've got the shops there over to the right-hand side. Just to touch on the application itself, the proposal was to extend the existing premises to create first and second floor accommodation comprising of a total of 6 flats. This also includes an extension to the side of number 1, which would on the ground floor be used to create cycle and bin storage at ground floor level, along with storage associated with the office, the retail unit at the front. At first floor, that would be used for the 7th self-contained flat. These images just show the side elevations of the proposed development, just to give an idea of the sort of visual impact of the scheme and how it relates to its immediate context. I've also shown this 3D view, just showing the extensions and how they would look in the context of both neighbouring 85 Daventry Road and number 1 Illminster Avenue. This is just showing the layout at ground floor level. So you've got the extended shop, as you've heard, it would be extended. You've got on there cycle storage and bin store areas, which would be associated with both the shop and the proposed flats. And then, as you can see, to the left-hand side, you've got number 85 Daventry Road, and to the right, you've got 1 Daventry Road, which would be incorporated into the development as part of the proposals. This just shows you the proposed first floor plan arrangement. Again, it shows number 1, it wants to be incorporated into the scheme, and it shows the various flats. This is the second floor layout, again showing the second floor flats and how it relates to the neighbouring number 1 Illminster Avenue. In terms of publicity, we did have a total of 29 comments from residents who wrote in directly, plus there's a petition all in support of the scheme. We initially had 2 objections you heard when the application was first submitted from both neighbouring 3 Illminster Avenue and 85 Daventry Road, just raising concerns about previous work and concerns about impact. Let's turn into the key issues then. So the first main one is just in terms of the principle. It would create additional residential housing and extend the shop premises. So we would do that. So that's that issue. In terms of the shop premises, although it doesn't comply with policy extending the shop outside a local centre, the applicant has provided information to show that there's a demand for that shop in that location. The next nearest local centre is Ford Broadway, which is quite a kilometre away and it's not really within reasonable walking distance. Although we only give it limited weight, the emerging plan designates Melvin Square as a future local centre. Let's go in terms of design. I've shown a comparison there for the previous scheme, which was refused and also dismissed by the inspector. The difference between that scheme and this one is, this new scheme is smaller. However, it does incorporate number 1 as part development when the previous scheme was built within the confines of the site. This gives you an idea of just the comparisons of the two schemes. So yeah, as I've said, the previous scheme was built within, was going to be built within the triangular part of the site. And on the one on the right-hand side shows the proposed scheme incorporating number 1 Illminster Avenue. Again, this is showing the comparison between the two schemes at first floor level. This gives you an idea of the differences. And this one shows the differences of the second floor level. Just in terms of the issue with amenity, yeah, you would have been provided with the shadow diagram. As I've said in the amendment sheet, it doesn't provide all the information officers feel would change the recommendation. I would point out on the shadow diagram that it would suggest that there would be a bit more of an impact from the revised scheme during the summer, during at the latter part of the day. So there would be a slight difference there. I wouldn't say it would suggest the area is really overshadowed, but like I said, in the summer it would suggest there'd be a bit more of an impact. Although the other issue is regarding the additional extension and the impact that would have on neighbouring 85 Daventry Road. Just on the highway consideration, those have more or less been resolved. This just shows you the changes to layout. There'll be a loading area. They've shown the tracking diagram. But those details would have to be conditioned in the event that the scheme was to be approved. It would also involve just some removal of a telegraph pole, moving the post box, and as you see there, there's a cycle stands for visitors to the premises. So just to conclude, whilst as you heard, the changes to the shop and the addition of residential accommodation to the site would benefit the area in respect of additional housing, improving the shop. Officers conclude that those benefits to the wider area are not outweighed by the concerns that the scheme has in terms of its visual impact and of concerns regarding amenity, even though we note that the scheme has somewhat been reduced to try and alleviate those concerns from the previous scheme. However, the concern is that those haven't been completely overcome, and therefore officers recommend the application for refusal.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions? Starters. Okay, whilst members are thinking, could you just outline the reasons for refusal, please?
That's fine. So the first reason is to do with the design impact on the surrounding area in terms of the additional scale created by the combination of extension to the shop, the storage areas, and also the flats at first and second floor level. And the concern is that this site is more compact compared to, say, Carpenter Place, which has been mentioned, although arguably that's a different context because of the plot size, and that didn't include integrating neighbouring residential properties as part of this design. The second reason is the concern over the impact of amenity of neighbouring properties. We know that there hasn't been objections following the revisions. However, the concern remains actually that the combination of the height and the proximity of the extensions would have an overbearing impact on those neighbouring properties.
Lovely, thank you very much. Fabian.
Apologies for my sort of chest infection. I'm sure it'll pass in time, but the at the other end of the square is the Carpenter's Place. Did that, which seems to be 3 or 4 floors and disrupts the sort of 2-storey and pitched roof rhythm of the area already, did that get permission? Was that given permission by us or by delegated powers, or did it get built on appeal? Did it get permission on appeal?
Yeah, I'm not sure the answer to that one. We'll have to double check that. I believe it was delegated. It was given grant consent, but I'd have to double check that.
I can answer that because I was at the meeting.
Go for it.
It was at a planning meeting because I was here when it.
Thank you. But could you go through the chair, please, rather than just shouting out? Thank you very much. Okay, so Chris, you had your hand up next to have a question, didn't you?
Yeah, mine goes back to one of the things from earlier, the construction traffic. I couldn't find anything in the papers about it because it is on a main bus route from Daventry and Illminster, and it's a very tight area. So my main concern is the first one is the construction traffic report. Is that what it's called? Yeah, that's it.
So with the construction, as TDM, we've recommended the application of a construction management plan condition be applied if approval were to be granted. And then that would set out how they'd manage construction and limit the impact upon the highway network. In terms of what's been submitted, at present, little detail to no detail has been submitted on the construction phase.
Okay. So if it's just say it is agreed, then you will do a more detailed. It wouldn't need to come back to committee, would it? You would do that. And secondly, just a quick update, really. I noted the people's objections prior to the changes. There's no, obviously those objections have been removed, and the shape of it is pretty much what I would like to see, something a little bit different myself. You didn't take that into account when you made your decision to refuse, that the objections had been removed?
Well, we did take it into account, but overall we have to look at the merits of the overall scheme as well, and then assess the impact of it. So yeah, even though the person who wrote in previously, I think on 85, didn't raise that objection, fine, haven't commented, but we still have to assess the overall merits of it, and the concern still remains, even though they lifted objection, that the additional bulk of the scheme would have an impact. So yeah, that was the conclusion reached there. But we note that the neighbours haven't objected following the reconsultation of the scheme.
Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. Andrew?
Thanks. I've just got, obviously it's come to us for the reasons you've outlined in the report. Quite often we see things that have come to us because because the applicant have sort of basically pushed the issue, and they've sort of come to an impasse in terms of discussions between the planning department and the applicant. Has that been the case in this scenario? Is that why we're seeing it at this point rather than trying to pursue things to a point where you could recommend approval?
I think in answer to that, it was. I think the decision was just taken that although we were recommending refusal of the scheme, it had quite a lot of public comments from it, and they had the petition as well. And when we have situations like that, we just on balance we just decide that should be taken to committee just to be considered at the agenda, and the conclusion was that it should be heard. So even though it was a case where the officers felt we couldn't support the scheme, we were aware of the amount of public interest in it, and also councillor interest there. Therefore, in that situation, we then naturally revert to committee for consideration. That's all I can say about that.
I'll just add to that it wasn't officially called in, but Councillor Goodman did request that it come to committee for consideration, which is why we're seeing it. Lorraine?
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question, actually. I'm looking at the picture on the first page, I think, like the site location picture. Oh, sorry. At the site location picture, I think it might be the first one, because it gives me the best image. I think it's page 2. You've gone off the main screen, Chair. That's all right. Yeah, that one. Yeah. So just looking at the building as it sits there, how tall would it be in comparison to the rest of the houses? And is it going to square off as well? Because I think that's what it shows. So looking at it frontal, will it square off and be really tall compared to the rest of the houses?
I think the intention is, so on that drawing you can see the, I think the upper floor extension at the rear. So you can see, so I'm trying to really picture it. So you've got that roof extension to the rear. I think the intention is to take it to that, to that height.
Sorry.
I don't think it's going to go higher than that from the drawings.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So up to where the red brick is, Chair. Up to where the red brick is, sort of, where the little orange. That's not orange, is it? The red thingy is.
Sorry to jump in. I think slide 8 is it that has. It's slightly confusing because there's lots of lines attached to it. But maybe if we can look at that one.
Oh, slide 8.
large.
Yeah, let's
No, I
find
did
that
say
one.
that one.
Oh, was it this one?
Yeah.
Slide 8. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
It's kind of hard to see because they're kind of pale, and there's lots of lines, but
Yeah.
it's kind of similar, isn't it? Can you see that, Lorraine?
I can. So which is the building now? On that, I'm just being a bit thick today.
Are they taking
it's not
down the
sh-
existing building and then building something else?
That's not moving.
No. It's basically to extend the existing building. So you've got, you've got a rectangular building at ground floor level, and the intention is to build extensions upwards. You have various recesses as well, balconies, and other features just to break it up. But it's not to actually rebuild the whole development. It's actually just, but, it's an extension. But obviously, it reads as a new build, and if you look in isolation, it looks like that. But the intention is to just extend it. Has various design features added to it.
I'll let you ask, Lorraine, or did you want to ask another?
No, that was sorry, Chair. I was just trying to get a sense of scale upwards. That was,
Okay.
if you see what I mean.
I've just got a question about, so it's a house that's been extended around. Is that what's happened? To
What,
have the shop and
You
then...
mean number 10? Well,
No, the one on the corner. Yeah. Number 10?
Yeah, we mean number 1. You mean neighbouring property?
Yes, number
Sorry.
1.
Yeah, so historically that was a house. However, in the application, it shows that at the moment it's used as a ancillary storage, and then there's accommodation above. It's not self-contained at all. Historically, it was a house, number 1. Now it's used as part of the shop. Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Okay. But on slide number 2, where you've got the little Google dot on, it looks like it's a house in the middle, and then the shop is around it as an extension. Is that right?
Why is this?
Sorry, this is in relation to number 10 itself.
Number 10.
Yeah. Well, number 10 historically was built as a detached property, so it's slightly different from the other properties in that location. And I understand it was like a post office before, and in recent years they had consent to extend the shop because they just needed more space. So what you've ended up with is this slightly different detached property, which now has this large ground floor extension on it. But yeah, historically it was built as the shop in that location to serve the residents.
So sorry, this is probably a stupid question. Is that coming down and something else going up, or is stuff being built on top of that?
My understanding is it's all going up, so nothing's actually coming down. It's all going to be just integrated with it. For example, you've got the property there where the intention is to build an extension link in the two, building upwards on the footprint of the existing property.
Okay.
That's my understanding of it anyway.
Does that make it clearer for you, Lorraine?
Okay.
Okay, Guy.
Thank you, Chair. Struggling to get my head around this ever so slightly. I can't recall a situation where we had a recommendation for refusal on the basis of potentially, or one of the reasons for refusal being a loss of residential amenity to neighbours, and there being no one here to complain or to express concerns, nor does it say there are only 2 objections throughout the entire process. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, there were 2 objections. Yeah.
Is there any, could you give us any insight into that, or is it just one of those things?
It's just one of those things. I guess what I'd say about the 2 objections, they relate to people who live immediately next door to it. That's what I can say about that. Their properties adjoin the site, and they originally raised concerns about the proposal. Well, they haven't now, but you know, we have to take it into account because they previously objected to the last scheme. And you know, like I said, we have to consider those points against our policies.
Okay, and the only other thing I wanted to check was just in terms of our sort of policy when applied in this case, the neighbouring property that's currently, I think it said in the report, unlawfully being used as a storage room for the retail unit, but that is for planning purposes a single dwelling. Are we in danger of ending up in a situation where we've granted planning permission for something that renders that property in effect unusable as a single dwelling, but unable to change its planning consent to the retail use it's currently being used for? In other words, if someone was living there, I would imagine they might be complaining, but no one is because it's being used unlawfully for something else. Are we kind of pushing ourselves into a catch-22 situation, I suppose, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, yeah. So that's what would happen. Yeah. Yeah, just an answer to that. If you were to grant approval of the scheme, it would be regularising number 1. So our forces have said to us that the reason, at the moment, I mean, there's issues with that, but I mean, they said actually, I mean, with this scheme, depending obviously what decision will be, that will obviously influence it. So yeah, I mean, my response to that would be, the approved plans show number 1 be incorporated as part of the scheme. So yeah, if it was to grant approval, that would regularise what's there because that's been utilised as part of this scheme. Yeah.
Chair, just to follow up on that very quickly, if I may, not wishing to sort of bind you or anything, but what would your sort of informal assessment be of the likelihood of a planning application to change it from the permission it currently has to the permission that would be regularised as a result of this? How likely would that be to succeed if they applied to change it from a single residence to C3 commercial? How likely would that be to succeed?
Yes.
I think it's hard to say because that's not, sorry to cop out, it's not the application before us really, so we can't really anticipate what that is. I think we just got to look at the proposal before us really. Obviously you've got the officer advice regarding it, but if in the event that members were satisfied with the proposal, it would regularise both properties for the uses proposed.
If the committee was minded not to accept the officer recommendation, which conditions would you be wanting or need satisfied?
Oh, just general conditions, you mean? Sorry. Well, I mean, there'd be a range of general ones to do. Well, you heard about it. There'd be the transport highway ones, like construction management. We'd have to attach those ones. There'd also be ones in association with sustainability matters. They would have to be conditioned as well. Design details in terms of materials. I mean, they're the general ones, really. Just to ensure that that development comply with the plans.
Okay, thank you. Gary, did you want to add?
Yeah, only just if that was to happen, I think we'd have delegated authority to finalise that list of conditions. But Ken's given a flavour as to what the main ones would be.
Lovely, thank you very much. Okay, if nobody's got any more questions, let's move on to the debate. Who would like to kick us off? I go for Andrew with an opinion, then Fabian, and then Chris.
Thanks. I found this one quite difficult to get my head around from the way it was outlined in the papers. I found the paper's quite confusing this time around. But I have had the fortune of being going to a regular series of meetings up nearby lately, so I've managed to sort of see the site in all its drizzly glory. It tends to be a wet Wednesday afternoon that I've been up there, and I'm of the view that that this proposal will improve the street scene, will improve the aspect of the square. I appreciate the reasons given for refusal, and that you would argue that you could argue that it's not necessarily what you would choose if you were starting from scratch to put in that space, but we're not starting from scratch, and what is being proposed looks a damn sight better than in my view, than the current building. I appreciate that there will be an impact on neighbours, but we see elsewhere in the city blocks of 8, 9, 10 more stories being proposed next to rows of terraced houses, and that in terms of in comparison to some of the other applications we've seen, I don't think the loss of residential amenity is enough to warrant the benefits of the scheme. And yes, Philwood's a planned estate, but nonetheless, that has its consequences as well, as is recognised in the papers with the lack of 1 and 2 bedroom places. So I'll be voting to reject the officer's recommendation and to approve this application.
Thank you. Fabian, then Chris.
Yeah, I too will be not supporting the officer recommendation on this. I do think it's a huge improvement on what's proposed. Is a colossal improvement on what's already there. Public responses have been in support of the scheme, and that's with virtually no objections this time. It's certainly an improvement on the original proposal they had, which did look a bit plain and was a bit overbearing. But this is step back and shakes back. But also, the thing that really sort of stuck with me was the Carpenter Place at the other end of the square. So you'll have two which already breaks the sort of height of the terraced houses. So it's not going to be one slightly bigger building intruding in an area of everything the same height. There's already one at the other end, so that's like two ends of the square. So if anything, it'll actually make the square a bit more symmetrical. And I think what's already there, Philwood still doesn't have a supermarket. If we can get them make more fresh produce available, that's got to be good for healthy eating and stuff like that. Yes, we are regularising number 1 Illminster Road, but these proposals will put a split level flat in there on the upstairs, and it will actually bring the whole thing under sort of planning control properly. I do think it's a monumental improvement on what's already there, which is okay. It's been extended over time, but it isn't very attractive, is it? So yeah, I do respect officer opinions, but sometimes we have to disagree with them for the right reasons, and I think this is one where I will definitely be supporting the officer. Will definitely be supporting permission for this, and therefore not supporting the officer recommendation.
Good, excellent. Do you need a cough sweep, by the way, Fabian? Do you need a cough sweet? Okay. Good. Okay. Chris.
Thank you, Chair. I respect the officer's work and time on this, but I think it will enhance that area, which does need some regeneration. My only concern is, and I'd like it, is the construction plan, because that is a main bus route in and out. There's a school opposite. I'm more than happy for officers to deal with that. That is my only issue with it, but it will enhance the area, and I don't agree with the reasons for the refusal. So I'll be voting against the officer's recommendations and voting to accept.
Fabulous. Thank you. Lorraine, then Leslie, please. Ooh, into the mic though, Leslie.
When I first saw this, I thought sounded very good. It was housing, it was enhancing the store that was already there. Everybody seemed to want it. But then the more I read it, the more I thought I started to think it wasn't a good idea. And when I saw the pictures towards the end, the bulk of it, the front doesn't look too bad, but the rest of it, the back, it's absolutely overbearing. So I will be supporting the officer.
Thank you. Lorraine?
Thank you, Chair. I'm still a little bit confused because that's what I am today. I think it's really difficult. So I've got a couple of kind of little niggles, which is the focus on housing, and I'm like, is that going to be who will the housing be for? Do you see what I mean? Is it more HMOs? I'm just curious about the housing slant of things. But with respect, I don't know that area, so there's parts of me that want to be guided by people that do, so the residents, the councillor, and so forth. So I'm in that sort of slight dichotomy as to it was a little bit confusing, as you know, because I've already asked a confusing question. So yeah, I'm still on the fence, but more than likely, with respect to the officer, I'm probably going to.
Just to put you out of your misery, Lorraine, sorry. If you look at slide 11, for example, it's got the floor plan of the first floor, and they're split up into individual flats. So there's a 1-bedroom flat and a 2-bedroom flat at the front. They've both got little balconies, and then there's a 1-bedroom flat at the back with the square bit, and then there's like off to the right hand side of it there's another sort of 1-bedroomed place. And if you go down to the next slide, there's another 1-bedroomed at the front with a little, that one don't think has a balcony, and a 2-bedroomed upstairs and another 1-bedroomed flat upstairs. So they're all individual self-contained flats. They're not HMO. It's not going to be a HMO from this layout. It can't be.
That kind of makes it a little bit more worrying, Chair. This seems quite a lot for the space, but I don't know. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Fabian, you had your hand up as well?
I was only going to, through you, Chair, and I was only going to point out the plans, but you've already done that, so that's fine.
Fabulous, great. Well, great minds. Okay, I think at this point what I'll do is I'll test officer recommendation if nobody has anything else that they particularly would like to say. Do I have a seconder for the officer's recommendation to refuse? Okay. Leslie is seconding motion to refuse. So I will take a vote by hand. Well, I'll call your name. We'll go from this side. So officer recommendation is to refuse. Fabian?
Against.
Chris?
Against.
Andrew?
Against.
Leslie?
For.
Lorraine?
Can I abstain, please?
You, of course you can. Guy?
Against.
And it's an against from me as well. So officer recommendation falls. I'm very sorry. Okay, so then I don't think we really want to defer it, do we? Nobody wants that. No. So we will go for just checking, but we'll go for officer recommendation against. No, can't speak. Okay, so to approve the application, who would like to propose that and second it?
I'm happy to propose it, but add the point that Draco's raised about the building management plan needing to be included in the conditions,
Exactly.
given the location.
Yeah, so it's a construction plan.
Construction plan.
There's some traffic
Yep.
schnazzles going on there as well. And there was a third one. What was the third one?
I think there was reference to design details and that. So they're fairly standard conditions that we would cover. So
Good.
I think if the motion included delegation to officers to complete the conditions, but especially the ones that have been highlighted.
Exactly. I think we can be happy to do that under delegated.
I mean, I think we all generally like, those of us who are supporting it, generally like the look of the thing as proposed. You know, so
Okay.
that's great. Okay, so I'm happy to propose that.
You're happy to propose that. So Fabian's proposing that. Andrew wanted to second it, unless Chris is wanting to take ward. Do you want to, as ward member?
I'm more than happy to give way to my colleague.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Very amicable over there. Okay, so we'll go for names along here. So this is to approve, subject to various conditions. Fabian?
4.
Chris?
4.
Andrew?
4.
Leslie?
Against.
Yep. Lorraine?
I'm just abstaining for various reasons, but I'm not. Yeah, I'm going to abstain.
Okay, that's fine. Guy?
4.
And it's a 4 from me. Okay, so that's approved. Thank you very much. We'll move on to the next item. Is anybody having a burning desire for a comfort break, or shall we just crack on with exciting... Okay, we will take a... So 10 past, back here by then. Thank you very much. People down to speak. So we've got the traffic light system. So 1 minute to speak, when it's green, that's your minute, and then amber halfway, and then red when your time's up. Okay, so first off, Andrew Folks, please.
Yeah, I'm speaking in support of the LDO. In 2019, studies conducted to form the One City Climate Strategy found that generating heat accounted for 45% of the city's carbon emissions, and that developing a district heating network was a key mean to achieve the 2030 decarbonisation goal. The council has since invested in the development of Bristol Heat Network, which is now serving over 2,000 homes with reliable low-carbon heat. The LDO is critical to the next phase of development, as it will enable the rapid expansion of the network to serve more businesses and residents across the city, without which we cannot contemplate reaching that 2030 target. It will also serve any other heat network operator should competition develop in the future. Additionally, the proposed LDO takes into account the varied stakeholder needs across the city and helps put the network more on a par with other utilities. Combine this with the fact that Vattenfall, as BCC's strategic partner for heat network development, has a wealth of experience operating networks across Europe, serving over 2 million customers for over 3 decades. That should give the confidence that any works carried out under the LDO will continue to be done so at the highest possible standards and in constant consultation with local communities.
Thank you very much. Okay, then we've got Len Wyatt, please.
Good evening. I'm representing the Bristol Parks Forum Committee. Just basically 2 very simple points. This order is giving powers over a wide area of Bristol. And our point is, can there be a requirement on allowing further consultation on the detail as individual parts of the order get carried out? I don't think anybody's going to be doing it all at once. Our second point is to say thank you to the City Council for the way that they've tackled our objection. It's quite rare, my personal experience is it's quite rare for developers to come back out and start talking to objectors at this sort of period of time. And we would recommend it to other developers to take forward. And that's all it is. Thank you very much.
Fabulous, thank you. And then Dominic Hogg, please.
I agree with all of that. I think a heat network is in essence a great idea. The problem is, and the justification for this order is about decarbonisation, and the problem is that the source of heat that's going to come through City Leap to actually feed into the network is an incinerator. That's one of the main sources. That is not a low carbon source of heat. It will generate, according to government figures and the way they should say that the carbon emissions should be allocated, it will generate heat on a good day, if it goes well, probably about 40% higher than gas. So if we're going to do this, let's make sure we're doing it for the right reasons. And we're not digging up the streets so that we can lock in people to a heat source that comes from something that would actually rather not be there. And so my plea here is to make sure that we attach a condition that actually says we're not going to facilitate sources coming onto the network which are high in carbon intensity, and we actually have a threshold which we won't allow heat sources to be above.
Lovely, thank you very much. Okay, so then we'll move to the officer presentation. Are you ready to go? And again, we've got the slides sent to us from earlier.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll be presenting on the local development order for a Bristol heat network.
Just lean into the mic a bit.
There we go, hopefully that's better. I'll just run over what is a local development order, the aims and objectives of the order, a brief overview of what the order includes, the consultation around the order, and then how we've considered consultation responses. So local development orders, essentially, they're a simple tool to allow a local planning authority to introduce new permitted development rights for certain uses. So they're intended to be flexible and consistent with local determination. Associated with this, attached are policy maps, statement of reasons outlining the justification for the order, a description of the development permitted, and then any restrictions and conditions attached to the order. And then, of course, subject to a statutory consultation period and then formal adoption by the LPA. This is a brief overview of the area covered by the LDO in brown, and then any areas outside of this are excluded from the order. So the aims and objectives are to essentially facilitate the infrastructure to enable the distribution of low carbon energy sources, aiming to contribute to the city's aim of carbon neutrality by 2030, aligning with the ambitions set out in the One City Climate Strategy and the Bristol Core Strategy. So this is a description of development. Just first off, I'd just like to clarify, development outside the scope of the order will still require planning permission and will be considered in the normal way. And the purpose of the order is to permit development rights for the installation of this heating, transmission and distribution system, comprising of ancillary infrastructure, inclusive of above ground infrastructure, together with the reinstatement works on defined areas of land within the City of Bristol, again subject to certain conditions and restrictions that I will run through shortly. Again, clarifications on the actual scope of the order. First of all, the order has been developed to be heat network developer agnostic. Essentially what this means is the LDO is open to all heat network developers, but just to clarify, the scope of the order is solely for the heating, transmission and distribution network with ancillary infrastructure only, and is only essentially required to join the dots between the heat source and then any connection to any individual buildings. To clarify, it does not give consent for heat sources that may provide heat to the network in the future, and it does not give consent for connections from the heat network to individual buildings. Both the connections to heat sources and connections to buildings will be required to adhere to low carbon local plan policies when they come forward for consideration. So just to run over the part 2 of the order, which stipulates any restrictions that we've built in. So it relates to restrictions to above ground infrastructure limitations with regards to height and volumes, any sort of depth and width limitations for the trenches, restrictions for any above ground pipework, and any EIA development thresholds. It limits above ground development within the boundaries of heritage designations, similarly with environmental designations. It limits restrictions where Article 4 directions are in place, and additionally development on sites identified as parks, woodland or playing fields. The conditions attached to the order in Part 3 briefly comprise an expiry, so the lifetime of the order, any particular requirements to be signed off for design, conditions attached to trees and hedgerows and the maintenance of them, again with biodiversity, protected species and protected sites, development within the boundaries of heritage assets, archaeology, contaminated land, the importation of soils onto site, and a lot of requirements within the construction environmental management plan, an addition of a condition for works within high-risk coal mining areas, any post-construction conditions, and then finally the reinstatement of land. Just to briefly go into the highlighted bold conditions. So with regards to prior to the commencement of development, any colour materials of any above ground infrastructure shall be specified and agreed in writing with the LPA. Similarly, with biodiversity, protected species and protected sites, where the installation is likely to cause any adverse impacts on green spaces or protected species and sites, any surveys and proposals for mitigation and habitat reinstatement shall be submitted to and agreed in writing by the LPA prior to the commencement of that park development. Again, any development where we are within the boundary of a designated heritage asset, then the location, design and materials of that above ground development will be agreed in writing by the LPA. And then we've got quite a lot of detail to be agreed within the construction environmental management plan, so no development shall take place until this has been agreed, and that will control and mitigate the effects of traffic, noise, vibration, dust and light, just to name a few. And then it will also include details of phasing, inclusion of any above ground infrastructure, any impact on the highway with regards to anticipated highway closures, construction hours, and then measures to control the storage of any chemicals. And then just on the reinstatement as well for condition 13, reinstate the land to the condition which existed prior. Part 4 of the order just covers off the point that the order does not grant, it grants planning permission for certain types of development as described in Part 1. It does not grant any other consents that may be required under other legislation. Part 5 and Part 6 just deal with the procedure for written approval where it's been built into the order pursuant to conditions 2, 3 and 4, and then sets out the timeframes for that approval from the local planning authority. And then the final part of the order, it just stipulates where the order map should be kept under review and updated periodically to ensure that it reflects the up-to-date planning and policy designations. So before seeking to adopt the order, the Council must consult for a period of no less than 28 days. We must take account of all the responses received and then take on board any comments with regards to any modifications. So we went out to consultation in middle of December last year for a total of 38 days. And we received 39 representations on the order, of which 6 were in support, 26 neutral and 7 objections. So to summarise, the main objections we received were with regards to parks and green spaces, any construction phase impacts and the impact on traffic and transport. Therefore, we took these comments on board and we made amendments to the order presented today with regards to the removal of development on sites identified as parks, woodlands and playing fields, the addition of a condition 12 where we are working within high-risk coal mining areas, and then further requirements added to the construction environmental management plan condition. And to summarise, we believe that the local development order is adopted as at Appendix 1, and that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Chris has a question.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah. I was reading through the main papers in the week, and I looked at the coal mining areas, and I'm glad it's obviously a condition, high-risk coal mining. How many of those are there in Bristol?
Yeah, so that came up through the consultation period and then with the coal authority, and it's just that there are certain defined areas that have been built into the order where we will ensure that any works in coal mining areas as identified on the maps by the coal authority, there'll be certain measures to protect where we do enter those areas.
Right. My second question is, because obviously you can't say like 25 areas and how many acres that covers. Could this be detrimental to this being a benefit of the LDO for the heat network?
I think it's just in response to health and safety measures. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. So I've got Guy, then I've got Leslie. Oh, well, yeah, we'll let Leslie go first.
All right. If can we have a condition if the verges are going to be dug up? Because I'm always being told that the services just underneath the surface. If we had a condition, then everything should be buried deep enough, both the existing and the new pipes. And I imagine that highways could give us that information. I'm sorry, that's enough. I can't talk anymore.
Thank you very much, Leslie.
So there's going to be a condition on the local development order which requires where there's been any sort of where they've dug up the highway, that will be reinstated to the condition it was before it was dug up. So that condition's applied. In terms of depths of the pipe work, I'll probably need to refer back to the heat network team.
The local development order provides permission to dig a trench up to 4 metres in depth. It doesn't provide any permission to install pipework beneath that depth. And the submission of the plans in the construction environment management plan would include the depths the pipework was intended to go at. And so that would be agreed in writing with the council. So all of the depths would be set out and agreed in writing, but they couldn't go any lower than 4 metres in depth.
Oh, can you use your mic?
Will the roads be able to be widened if necessary then, if these pipes are buried up to 4 metres deep?
The roads shouldn't need to be widened as a result of any of these works.
No, for any other reason. Because I'm tired of being told, oh, we can't do that because the services are just underneath, when I want a simple thing done for the ward.
I mean, the proposals that will come in following the local development order will they're kind of, it's new infrastructure for the heat network, so they'll go in places where it's practical to actually deliver it, really. So obviously the more congested an area is below ground for existing utilities, the more a challenge it is, and it might direct the heat network somewhere else, obviously to serve the parts of the city it needs to. But because it's a whole network approach, I think there's more flexibility in doing that, really.
Does that satisfy you, Leslie?
Not really, but I can't talk anymore.
Okay, all right, thank you. Could you turn your mic off and then we'll go to Guy, please? Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. So I've never done one of these before. Have we as a council done one of these before?
We have, yes. In the early days of the Temple Quarter enterprise zone, that coincided with encouragement from central government to do local development orders. They'd been around as a mechanism for years and years, but no one really ever did them. And I think central government at the time gave us real encouragement to actually do some related to the Temple Quarter enterprise zone. And so one was to allow on plot 3, which is still undeveloped. It's the bit between the kind of the Temple Quay office development and the floating harbour on, I think, the south side. So it's that big, still vacant site, which is under Homes England ownership. It gave again, in a conditioned way, an advanced permission, because that's what this effectively is, for a number of uses. I remember there was the circus, there was a big top, and there was various other units. They all came in on the local development order. So that's one example. The other example was on Temple Island. There was a local development order, and there still is now, to again grants advance permission for like urban agriculture, and there was a number of polytunnels on it, and I don't know what was grown on them, by the way, but it actually was an advance permission for that to happen. So 2 rather random examples, but they're the only 2 that I'm aware of. And so this is the kind of thing that makes much more sense, because it's citywide. It's the delivery of an infrastructure on the back of a really big initiative. So Whereas one might think the other two were rather gimmicky. This is a genuine case for a local development order to give advance permission, but subject to lots of conditions and controls for things to happen that might just kind of have to require planning permission otherwise.
Because what I'm wondering is, obviously this quasi-judicial committee, I sit on planning, sit on licensing, sit on PSP, very familiar with the concept of what are and aren't material considerations. And I'm not sure with something like this, when it's an LDO rather than one of the usual applications that we come across, what are the material considerations? Is it what would normally be material considerations for a planning application of this scale? Is it all of our planning policies taken collectively? What are the things the committee should be bearing in mind?
So the committee can only consider planning issues because it's a planning mechanism. I think the way to think about this is that it's the opposite of an Article 4 direction. So an Article 4 direction is when the local authority steps in and tightens up control and says something that would normally be permitted development actually now needs permission. It's not to say it can't happen, but it's under a decision has to be made under the remit of the local planning authority. This is pushing in the other direction by saying, look, in terms of to deliver the heat network across the city, there are lots of big things will still need permission, but there's lots of other things that will just consistently trip over the need for a planning application, and we'll probably be inundated with lots of technical applications for planning permission for things that could be considered holistically in this way. So I think this is a really good use of the power in saying that if the committee agree this, for all these reasons, with all these subject to all these controls and conditions, that this type of development can just go ahead, but again subject to all those controls.
So final question, I think, probably. What I'm wondering is the purpose for which the LDO granted a material consideration in its assessment? In other words, coming back to the gentleman's point from earlier, if the purpose is to provide a low-carbon heat network, it strikes me when you actually read the LDO, it doesn't make any reference to low-carbon at all. In fact, you could posit a situation where, say, the next administration of the council says, well, it's great, we've got this LDO, let's capitalise on it, let's build another incinerator, we'll provide 100% of the heat from high carbon sources because we're not interested in complying with the previous administration's environmental ambitions. I don't see what's in here that would stop someone from doing that. In other words, they'd have sweeping powers for the next 25 years to do that. So what I'm wondering is there a way of doing what the objector asked for? Because is that part of the thing that we can consider today?
So I'll jump in. So in the presentation, we did say that new sources of heat aren't permitted by the local development order. The local development order is there to put infrastructure that will either be supported by existing sources of heat, so at the moment waste heat, or other new sources of heat that are coming forward, such as the water source heat pump as well. So it doesn't give anybody any new powers to actually build new sources of heat. I don't know whether you wanted to kind of add to that.
Yeah, that's correct. And then any such examples would then be subject to their own planning application and to be considered in a normal way anyway. So.
Sorry, but just to be absolutely clear on that point then, the low carbon aspect of this doesn't feed into it in any sort of material way at all. As in, it locks us into the current balance of the heat to be provided into the network. Is that the case?
I would say it's inherent in the proposals, but it allows flexibility for the project to deliver, to either link into existing sources of heat. If, for example, the project by the administration wanted to create, just think radically a really different source of heat, then that in itself would need its own planning permission. But also, other more kind of low carbon sources of heat quite in themselves would also need their own planning application. So I think I understand this to be the network. What carries the heat around the city. The actual sources of heat that it will utilise, they either exist already and which aren't subject to any further controls, or they are to come. And one would imagine that there'll be low carbon sources, but again, that would be looked at on an individual basis as they come forward.
So I think somebody from the heat network team has an answer over there as well.
Yeah, so I'm John Buick, I'm the project manager for the LDO. So just to expand a little bit on what has been said there, any new generation plant would be subject to its own planning permission. So there would be controls on the level of emissions coming from that planning application. When we come to the customer end, it's actually a different set of legislation that governs the emissions factors that can be used in, and this relates to Part L of the building regulations. So if you have a high carbon heat network and you are talking about connecting that to a building, that building will then fail or struggle to meet its Part L requirements under building regs. And then also it would then struggle to meet its Part L and emissions reductions in BCC planning policy as measured and set by building regs. So you actually have the controls are set in different sets of legislation. There isn't actually the powers within the Energy and Planning Act for us to place a restriction as suggested on the emissions factor for the heat energy that's being put into the network. And like I say, that is actually controlled through Part L of the building regulations.
All right, okay, so Andrew had a hand and then I'll take the reins after that.
Yeah, so I saw some comment on social media that talked about the provision for above ground infrastructure, and particularly cabinets and stuff. And I've looked in the papers and I can see that there's restrictions on the size of any such cabinets. But I couldn't see anything about the placement of them. Would I be right in assuming that that's probably governed under some other policy somewhere in Bristol City Council?
So within the order, there are three separate measures to control the provision of any above ground infrastructure dependent on its proposed location. So the number one, we've got the restriction obviously in height and volume. Number two, where any above ground infrastructure is proposed to be within any designated heritage area, so I think it's conservation areas adjacent to any listed buildings, schedule, ancient monument, that would need to be agreed prior to commencement with the local planning authority. And then additionally, within the construction environment and management plan, the proposed location of such above ground infrastructure will also need to be agreed as part of that prior to the commencement of development again. Fine.
So there's controls to ensure that they're sort of tidy and out of the way and not causing blockages to pedestrians or cyclists or whoever else.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, lovely. And the other question I had, and this might be for the team, I noticed in the comments on the feedback from the consultation, I think it's clear from those that a lot of people didn't necessarily understand exactly what was being proposed in terms of this being an enabling device rather than, an actual, implementation of a network. But I did notice a couple of consultees sort of responded along the lines of about being kept informed of when roads are going to be dug up, and when there will be potential disruption from that. Would it be reasonable to assume that any such works that do come that are enabled by this would be on the one dot network sort of overview of roadworks and infrastructure works in the area?
So the way I see it, there's two sort of streams of control. So you've got the construction management plan, where there could be within that management plan a provision for advance warning of any works to dig up the roads, essentially, and additionally to put in the infrastructure, a Section 50 licence is required, and that essentially allows the pipes to go into the highway, and that's under the Highways Act. And within that licence, certain conditions can be applied, requiring advance warning as well. So there's two controls, essentially.
Right, thank you. Lorraine?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. I've got several points, so I'm going to just reel them off. So just based on what Andrew said about sites that will be protected, I heard that some specific sites would be protected, like buildings, protected buildings, whatever. I didn't hear that the same old story about other areas where we may end up with really ugly structures just popping up because they're not of the same value. That's just me making that point. I'm concerned, as the gentleman over there said, about doing a whole city approach to this, because Bristol has got so many different, there's even cities on the Bristol, old shops. There's lots and lots of different things, as well as mines, pipes, the whole infrastructure under the city. And I'm just curious about rolling out like a whole scheme that might never actually be able to connect because of all the different challenges. This is my ignorance, because this is not an area of expertise that I have. So I got concerns about this whole city approach, because it doesn't make any sense if you have to still go to planning and you still have to get agreements and permissions to actually do the scheme in a specific area. This is just me coming from a layperson's perspective. In your literature, right at the beginning, your aims say to achieve reduction in the council's CO2 emissions, but what you don't say is what does that look like, what type of reduction. It doesn't say that the scheme is going to help to reduce emissions, because you're saying it's just building the infrastructure to make it a possibility, but but there's no evidence to say that this is actually going to be viable. I'm nearly there. And and I think the gentleman's point about the source of heating, so if you're going to build a furnace where you're just where you're actually creating more of an emission than not, I would be concerned about. It's not like we're saying the UK or Bristol are going to provide the heat network. We're saying that anybody from across the globe could say, we want to do this in Bristol. So there's something that's slightly uncomfortable. I don't know if that makes sense. Something slightly uncomfortable about that we're setting the infrastructure there, and then Joe Bloggs can come along and say, hey, I've got this product, and you just, and the infrastructure's already there. So there's less opportunity for objections. So sorry, that was a bit of a ramble, but I'm not sure about this. It just seems highly not great for Bristol.
Okay, I can pick up on a few of them, and then other people may wish to stand in. With regards to the whole city approach and the sort of different way that it would be delivered through separate planning permission, I think the idea of a local development order does streamline that process, albeit it does require certain conditions and details to be signed off prior to the delivery of each phase. The lifetime of the order is for 20 years, at which time it can be reviewed at certain instances as well. With regards to other details, I don't know whether John wants to come in.
I think it is worth noting that the Centre for Sustainable Energy did a sizable piece of research into Bristol's zero carbon pathways to examine the different routes that the city could take in order to meet its net zero obligations. And that piece of work actually really came out in support of the use of heat networks The other alternative is that you go to a heavy electrification scenario, and the cost of upgrading Bristol's infrastructure to meet that increase in electricity demand would be exorbitantly expensive. So I do want to just press that there has been research done to support the use of heat networks in the pathway to zero carbon.
Just going to help clarify, I think there's a question in there as well about quantification of where it says reduction of CO2 and emissions, like what kind of quantification could be given as a reassurance. And I think there was also a question in there around the consultation process when individual projects come up as well. So if any answers that could be given for that would be quite helpful.
So if we take the second point first, any of the road closures need to be advertised in advance, and so the notifications about the individual traffic implications they're consulted on. So there is that level, and also all of the applications to discharge the conditions are also, they all go through the planning system, so they will all be on public record, although there wouldn't be any planning notices displayed in advance of applications to discharge those conditions. Really, to come back to the point on the LDO is for the transmission network, and is only for the transmission network. The issues that have been raised around the carbon intensity of the heat being put onto the network is really beyond the scope of the local development order. But as I have said, is then either controlled by an individual planning application for that heat plant, and then at the customer end for the buildings you're connecting to through Bristol's climate change policies and through Part L of the building regulations.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to add on to what's been said, really, and I just want to bring the committee back to the thing before you is the local development order. That is the planning mechanism to deliver the strategy. What you're not deciding today is the strategy. The strategy is, to a large extent, already be set, but obviously is subject to further checks and balances through currently Cabinet and any future committee processes as well, in terms of the council's role as client, in terms of the heat network partnership. So I just wanted to kind of ensure that really in your minds in making your decision today, it's about this planning mechanism, not the wider strategy. And I think we've answered questions about sources of heat and things like that, and hopefully the committee are reassured that any new sources of heat, whether they be seen as good or bad, they will be subject to their own planning applications anyway. They wouldn't be subject to this mechanism because it'd be too big and too controversial.
Thank you, Gary. And I think as well we can say that this committee is part of those checks and balances as well. So I think it is good to be asking those questions. Are you satisfied, Lorraine, for the moment? Yep. Okay. So then Fabian, and then I'll go back to Guy.
Yeah. So it's just, I think you've answered the question. I just wanted to make absolutely sure that what the sort of permission, the kind of energy that's put into, or heat generation that's put into, connected to this system, will be subject to separate planning applications and planning decisions. And so if somebody wanted to propose something that was environmentally not good as a source of energy for a heat network, we could refuse it on the grounds of the environmental impact.
That's right. You wouldn't have that sneaked through this local development order. You'd have a planning application before you that you could make a decision on based on all the planning issues.
Like some of the gas generators and other things that we've had in the past over the years that I've sat on DCs. Okay.
Guy? Into the mic. Oh.
Should be getting used to this by now. In terms of the EQIA, I was just wondering if you'd had any responses other than the one from the BDEF, and whether any attempt was made to reach out to anyone else.
I think we, as part of the consultation process, we contacted the equalities officer within the council. They provided a list of organisations that we should go out and consult with, which we did as part of the process, and we didn't receive any further comments.
Lorraine.
Sorry. Thank you, Chair. I wanted to ask 2 more questions and then I will be quiet. One is, my original question, which I forgot, which was asked but wasn't answered, was about if you're going to do a whole grid network of pipes or whatever it is you're going to do, and how will we know that deprived areas of the city are not just going to end up with monstrosities above ground because they're not in a conservation area? And secondly, what's the cost to this if 50% of it will never be connected, would never get utilised because of different factors? Because I don't know I'm being a bit unfair because I don't know how it would look, because I haven't looked into it that much. But if you're going to do a whole network approach to it, what's the cost to the city anyway?
Yeah, I'm happy to take your first point with regards to above ground where it is outside a designated area. So the 3 controls we have, only one of them will relate to a designated area. The restriction on heights and volumes is applicable to anywhere within the city, and additionally with the requirements through the construction environmental management plan, there'll be requirements within that to sign off and to agree the location of any above ground infrastructure, again, anywhere within the city. The second point.
So the network is developed subject to need, and so the network won't be installed in anticipation of in anticipation of connections. The network is actually rolled out once connection agreements have been made. And so there is a commercial agreement made between the heat network operator and a customer, and then the network is developed to meet that contractual obligation. So there won't be any instance where pipe work is developed and delivered ahead of time. There are 1 or 2 examples where the council has chosen to do that and install the pipe work ahead of time because that's a cost-effective way of doing it. But those are only in instances where there's new development coming forward in the area. And so by providing the pipe work ahead of time, it actually reduces disruption, and there's a very high likelihood of a customer connecting because those developments are required to connect through planning policy. So there won't be, if you like, any kind of abortive costs of pipe work being installed, but then not connected.
Okay. Guy, I'll leave you to have a last question. Okay, all right. Is everybody clear on what we are voting on and why? Good. Okay, we'll move to the debate section. Who would like to? Guy wanted to make a point. Start off with a point.
Thanks, Chair. I may still be swayed. When you look at the actual development order itself, it talks about granting permitted development rights for any number of things reasonably necessary for the purpose of the development permitted. And then when it talks about what the purposes of the development permitted are, it says a heating, transmission and distribution system. And it says a bunch of times in the officer's report that this is about a green heat network. This is about reducing carbon. There is nothing in this LDO that guarantees that. And I can't even see it as a material consideration to what's in front of us. It kind of is and it kind of isn't. We're told it's an enabling development to allow that to go ahead, but there's nothing to prevent it. I appreciate you couldn't add stuff on without getting additional planning consents, but what we don't know is if this thing is completely ineffective, there's nothing to say that the thing has to work in the first place. It is absolutely huge, looking at it. Absolutely massive, what the council's asking for itself, kind of, for permission to do. I can't ever remember anything being in front of the planning committee that's as large in scale as this thing, in terms of the impact on communities, the blank check that it's writing over the period of time that it's writing. I am a little bit worried that one of the things that happens as part of the planning process is that developments are refined. The need to get something through the process, the need to consult with the local community, the need to get something through a committee, sometimes at the end of the day, refines things. It improves developments. It causes a negotiation and a back and forth. I'm worried that that a blank check would lead to a situation where whoever is developing this is just able to press ahead without going through that process. I'm thinking of things just like the cost of materials used and that sort of thing. These are all things that can be considered as part of a normal application process that we're waving away if we agree to this. As I say, I'm not absolutely set. I'm still open to being persuaded. But the other thing that's in the back of my head is looking at the EQIA, and we've got a reasonably minor statement in from the Bristol Disability Equalities Forum. The EQIA I cannot see as being proportionate to this. I can't see how the committee could apply its mind to the equalities considerations here with this little in front of us, given the scale of of the application in front of us. At this point, I think I'm voting against, unless someone can talk me into it. Thanks, Chair.
Is there any scope with an LDO to apply conditions through this committee like we would normally have that scope with a planning application?
I think we'd have to have a look, because this is different to a planning permission, because the LDO would have to be, capable of being operated. If it was conditioned so much and it included things that it can't consider, then it would just be a useless instrument, basically. So we'd need to look at what those proposals would be.
I guess from what Guy's been saying there, it would be about making absolute clarity at every step as to what is being agreed to. If in the report it's talking about one thing but it's not being explicit about reducing carbon, or it's not being explicit about the environmental goals, and which would be the impetus of the committee wanting to vote for it. But if it's not clear and if it's not, because what we're voting on is what's written here, so it doesn't really matter what everyone's best intentions are if what we're actually agreeing to do doesn't have those intentions really clear. As Guy has said earlier, anybody could come along and use it for a different mechanism, because it's the concept of always sort of like, even though you hope for the best, planning for the worst possible usage or scope of any kind of mechanism that you put in, or any kind of rule or motion you agree to.
Yeah, I think personally that's going beyond the mechanism. It's going to the kind of the rationale of the network and what the network's there for, really, rather than the LDO is really the mechanism to transfer the heat around the city. So as to what the source of heat is, it's either what's existing, which exists, so there's no control over that, or it's what's to come, which will all be subject to their own individual applications, as we've said, really. So I think that's really kind of looking beyond the mechanism, really, and the kind of into really the way that the reason why the heat network project is there, really. I think it's asking a different question to it or not. You're kind of looking beyond that, really, which is something that, as I said, really, it's something that's either been set in train already or will be subject to checks and balances by in whatever form the administration, the council takes going forward.
Lorraine?
Thank you, Chair. I think this sort of discussion has been really helpful in formulating my thoughts, because I think the project manager over there said each case would be done sort of individually, like you wouldn't be laying, you wouldn't be laying pipes in advance. So I guess my thoughts are saying, well, if we're not going to do something in advance, why couldn't we just follow the normal planning processes that we do now? So somebody comes and says, this is the heat source I'm going to put in, other than maybe the schemes that would benefit from it being done in advance, like you've said. But I don't understand why we would need to have an advanced decision about something that we could decide in a planning application, if that makes sense, because it just doesn't seem right. And do you see what I mean? Because each decision is going to be made individually. That's what we're being told. So I'm kind of I'm veering towards not supporting that. Sorry.
Okay, Fabian, and then I think that was Chris's hand.
Yeah, I think I'm finding this quite frustrating. I'm reassured by the advice that what will happen is, if this is sort of order goes through, then if somebody comes along and says, I've got a completely eco system to put in to provide energy in this area, maybe a deprived area of Bristol where the cost of living is hit really hard, then at that point that network will go in, that part of the heating network will go in, if subject to ADC, this one or DCA, agreeing to the heat system that's proposed, unless it's already existing, in which case it's already. So, I mean, as I see it, this is simply a legal framework that's necessary to stop trying to get the whole thing done. Once we try and be carbon zero by 2030, that is 23 now, so we've got 7 years. So if we had to do each bit of the network, each bit of the pipes, each set of pipes with a separate planning application, it would be a nightmare. We'd never get it done. We'd still be trying to charge through it in 50 years' time. So I think this is the only way to get the sort of the boring bit of the pipes done. The rest, what actually turns up on top above ground, the kind of energy that's shoved down those pipes or heats the water that goes through those pipes, that's all subject to further planning controls and planning permissions that we or our successors will decide when those applications are put in. So, and if nobody comes forward with anything for heat, to expand a heat network, none of this will happen anyway. So I'm reassured we're not going to be shoving loads and loads of pipes underneath the city for no potential reason. We'll only put the pipes in when there's actually going to be a source attached to them. So I think, if we're serious about getting our emissions as a city down, this is an important enabler. The next bit's the issue of where the energy comes from, how sustainable that is, the issue of what infrastructure goes above ground, that could be decided at the time. This is simply a bit of getting the paperwork out, a bit of sort of technical stuff out the way, so that we can just focus in future on the issues of what kind of energy is proposed and what kind of infrastructure above ground is proposed, and we can deal with those on a case-by-case basis. So I'll be supporting this.
Chris?
Yeah, thank you to the officers for explaining some of the questions that were answered, because I was a little bit confused. But I'm the opposite of my colleagues over there, because I've gone through all this. There's so many conditions on this to safeguard us going forward. I mean, I can go on for ages about it. And I think it's a good idea that we're looking at it on a whole as a citywide thing. We constantly saying we're not brave enough, we're not outward looking enough. We keep doing all these little bits piecemeal here. This, I think, is a vital piece for us going forward. Yeah. And like what the officers have said, the amount of checks and balances that got to go through before anything can happen and what's been put into it, we need this urgently, as Fabian said, because we ain't got long before we need to be at where we. But there's so many checks and balances coming in afterwards. Have to come through the planning. There's no pre-work done, so there's nothing wasted. I think we need to adopt this, and I will be voting for it. And thank you very much for putting my mind at ease.
Andrew?
Yeah, I'm absolutely flabbergasted by the way this conversation has gone, frankly. Because what strikes me about this is it's a pragmatic and practical measure to facilitate the building over time of an infrastructure that's an alternative to gas for heating properties around this city. I appreciate the concerns about incineration and stuff, but there are so many other opportunities for heat generation around, whether that be from hydro in the form of the heat exchanges and or other sources around the city. So I'll be supporting this.
Thank you. Guy?
I appreciate what colleagues across the floor are saying. And I just want to be absolutely clear, like, I agree 100%. We need to deliver a heat network. That's not up for debate. What the officer's report says the ambitions of this project are, I agree with 100%, because the officer's report is quite clear. The purpose, if I can find the thing, is to deliver the infrastructure to enable the distribution of low-carbon energy sources, to achieve reductions in the council's CO2 emissions, to align with the ambitions in the One City Climate Strategy and the Bristol Core Strategy. Yeah, great, I absolutely agree with those purposes. Are those the purposes in the LDO? No. The purposes in the LDO say the provision of a heat network. Any heat network. That's what we'd be signing up to. And any development that happens under this permitted development order, which could include a 2-metre squared block of concrete in the middle of a public park, when...
Okay, can we not start calling out? If you want to speak, put your hand up or take your hands.
I want to be really clear. Some things would require additional planning consent. Some things clearly wouldn't under the LDO, because otherwise, why would you do the thing? Right? So things will be going in. And as soon as something unpopular happens, or something bad happens, or something ill-conceived happens, and I don't know who these developers are going to be, but they're not. This is not the council. The council won't be the developer in these cases, will it? It'll be private companies. For reasons of cost, for reasons of expediency, for whatever is being shoved in, the answer that the council will have to give to the people who are unhappy about it is, oh, don't worry, we stitched it up months ago by getting permission for it when no one had any clue what it was going to be. This isn't to rule out anything proposed in this. There's nothing to stop the delivery of the aims and objectives outlined in the officer's report through the normal planning process. You could scope this down. You could consult with a ward at a time. You could consult with a constituency at a time. You could take feed in from whoever you want to take it in from. But I guarantee you, in terms of the public consultation, if people had realised what this committee was being asked to give permission for was permission to do what is actually in this LDO, we would have had a lot more responses to the consultation. And I think the only reason people haven't is that they don't know what this committee is being asked to give permission for today. So I appreciate the strategic objectives. I agree with the strategic objectives. But I don't think this is the way of doing it.
Over on this side of the room, who would like to, as you're all shouting out, who would like to say anything else in response to that?
I think the things that the other side of the room seem to be worried about will be dealt with by future planning applications. This is simply an enabling thing to allow the pipes to go in. If somebody wants to propose a means of providing energy that is not acceptable, a future DC can throw it out.
I think what this whole conversation is kind of demonstrating is the real importance of absolute clarity in any motions or plans that are brought forward, and the need that perhaps there should have been a bit more clarity in the wording of the LDO to reassure some members about what the actual aims and objectives are, which we all support in its aims. Andrew, and then Lorraine.
With respect, Chair, all of us were invited to a briefing on this 2 or 3 weeks ago. So as well as the papers we've had here, we've all had an opportunity, or all did have an opportunity to hear more and ask questions previously.
Lorraine?
Yeah. I'm at a point where I'm quite frustrated sometimes with this sense that we don't get it. You know, the administration are doing all this great things and we don't get it. I do get it, and my questions are based upon what the costs are to the citizens and residents of Bristol if we are not going to be laying this grand scheme across the whole of the grid, why we cannot make decisions as an excuse me, as and when. And I'm not asking a councillor for an answer to that. I am pointing out that we are entitled to, one, not to be at briefings sometimes, because some of us has to work as well as be a councillor, and there are times when issues come up in planning that we have to question, because I have a free spirit and I am entitled to ask questions if I need clarity. So no one has answered the cost to this, to Bristol, because there are people, residents in Bristol, who will be affected. It doesn't matter whether we are laying, we're using nuclear fuel to fuel the, carbon net, whatever it might be, but we still have a right. I'm here to represent communities, and so I have questions and I'm entitled to ask them. So, cost of the scheme to us, or is there no cost? Because that's not been answered, and why we cannot agree in principle that we want this, as Guy has said, but why can we do this on an individual basis? I think I'm struggling why it has to be, yeah, go ahead and do it, whereas we're going to have to judge it on an individual basis anyway. Sorry for my ramble.
So, unfortunately, the answer on cost is a fairly straightforward one. It's not part of your consideration today. Because, as I've advised, really, you're looking at the mechanism, not the project behind it.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, I'm going to move us to a vote because we're going in a circle. Okay, so the question that you're being asked, the motion is to adopt the local development order. So can I have a seconder for that, please? I'll let Chris do this one because you didn't do the one earlier. I'll start from you, Fabian.
4.
Chris?
4.
Andrew?
4.
Leslie?
4.
Lorraine?
I'm going to abstain, thank you.
Guy?
It's against.
And it's a 4 from me, so that passes. Thank you very much, everybody. That brings our meeting to a close. Our next meeting is the AGM on the 10th of May. But more importantly than that, it's Gary's last Development B before he runs away and leaves us forever. Maybe he might come back. So thank you very much on behalf of all of the council for all of your work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Appreciate what you said there. And just to say, obviously, these meetings don't happen without democratic services, and Tom webcasting as well. So, thanks for all the work you do. We wouldn't do it without it. I'm just fortunate in that I just front the officer advice here, so all the hard work gets done by others as well. It's been a real honour to do the role, and also, we're here to advise yourselves, because at the end of the day, you've got the hardest job. You have to debate it in public, and at the end of the day, you have to stick your hand up in public as well, and we always respect the difficulties in doing that. So thank you very much for your kind words.
Thank you. Right, time to go to the pub. Bye-bye.